The dollar didn't collapse overnight. It started quietly, off-balance sheet deals, currency swaps no one talked about, energy contracts rewritten in rooms without cameras, and then one line crossed that should have set off alarms everywhere. Saudi Arabia agreed to sell oil outside the dollar. That single decision represents a $3 trillion fracture running through the global financial system. And it didn't happen by accident. It happened because a new monetary bloc just crossed a threshold the United States assumed could never be crossed. BRICS didn't announce a war on the dollar. They did something far more dangerous. They made it optional. For 50 years, the petrodollar was the invisible engine of American power. Oil was priced in dollars. Trade settled in dollars. Central banks were forced to hold dollars just to function. That demand allowed the U.S. to print, borrow, and spend at a scale no empire in history ever sustained. It looked like strength. It was leverage. And now that leverage is being unwound. This isn't about ideology or politics. It's about incentives. Nations don't abandon reserve currencies because they hate them. They leave when the math stops working. And the math has changed fast. Since 2020, global trade has fragmented. Sanctions turned currency into a weapon. Frozen reserves sent a message no central bank ignored. If dollars can be shut off, they're not neutral. And once neutrality disappears, alternatives suddenly look rational. China saw this first, then Russia, then Brazil, then India. Together, they didn't try to replace the dollar. They built parallel rails, separate payment systems, bilateral energy trade, gold accumulation, at a scale not seen since Bretton Woods collapsed. But none of that mattered until energy moved. Oil is the keystone. Control oil pricing, and you control global liquidity. That's why Saudi Arabia was always the final lock. And that lock just turned. The Petroyuan doesn't overthrow the dollar, it drains it. Every oil contract settled outside the dollar is demand that never comes back. Every central bank that doesn't need dollars stops recycling US debt. And when recycling slows, something breaks. This is not a future risk. It's an active process. What makes this moment dangerous isn't that the dollar is falling. It's that the world is quietly learning how to function without it. And once that learning curve is crossed, reversals don't happen. Because the last time a reserve currency lost its energy monopoly, the collapse didn't start with panic. It started with confidence that nothing had changed. And that confidence always comes right before the exit accelerates. For decades, the assumption was simple. Oil flows through dollars, dollars flow back into US debt, and the system sustains itself. It didn't need trust. It needed habit. And habits are powerful until something forces a rethink. That force was sanctions. When the West froze sovereign reserves, it didn't just punish one country. It revealed a flaw at the center of the system. Reserve assets were no longer truly owned. They were conditional, accessible only as long as alignment held. That realization landed quietly, but it landed everywhere. Central banks don't react emotionally. They react defensively. And defense starts long before headlines change. First came diversification, a little less dollar exposure, a little more gold. Then bilateral trade agreements that bypassed New York clearing. Then energy deals priced in local currencies, experimentally. None of it looked dramatic. That was the point. Because systems don't collapse when alternatives appear. They collapse when alternatives work. China spent years preparing for this moment, not by announcing a new currency, but by building infrastructure, settlement systems, swap lines, commodity exchanges priced in yuan. The goal wasn't dominance, it was independence. Russia accelerated the process out of necessity. Cut off from dollar markets, they rebuilt trade using energy leverage. Gas for rubles, oil for yuan, gold as a bridge. What looked like desperation became a template. Brazil and India followed for pragmatic reasons. Why hold a currency that can be frozen when trade can be settled directly? Why absorb FX risk when counterparties are willing to meet halfway? Each deal reduced friction, each success reduced fear. But energy was still the bottleneck. As long as oil stayed dollar-priced, the dollar stayed unavoidable. That's why Saudi Arabia mattered more than any announcement, more than any summit. Saudi oil isn't just volume, it's legitimacy. It's the psychological anchor of the system built in the 1970s. And when that anchor loosened, the shift became structural. Not because every barrel moved to yuan, but because some did. Reserve currencies don't lose status when everyone leaves. They lose it when enough people realize they don't have to stay. And here's the part most people miss. This transition doesn't show up first in exchange rates. It shows up in capital flows, in treasury auctions that need higher yields, in foreign demand that quietly doesn't return. When dollars stop being required, they don't disappear. They come home. And when they come home, the system that relied on exporting inflation is forced to absorb it instead. That's when the real pressure begins. Because the petrodollar didn't just support trade. It masked imbalances that were never sustainable on their own. And without it, the math changes fast. When dollars flow back instead of outward, the illusion of stability breaks. Not all at once, quietly. Through stress points most people don't watch. In the first place, it shows as debt. The United States doesn't finance itself the way normal countries do. It relies on external demand to absorb massive issuance. Treasuries aren't just funding tools, they're storage for global reserves. Or at least they were. When reserve demand weakens, borrowing doesn't stop. It just gets more expensive. Yields rise, not because growth is strong, but because buyers are thinner. Auctions clear, but only with higher compensation. Interest becomes the fastest growing line item in the budget, and every percentage point increase compounds into the future. This is the hidden cost of reserve erosion. You don't lose power first, you lose flexibility. For decades, the U.S. could respond to crises by printing and borrowing without consequence. Inflation stayed muted because excess dollars leaked abroad. Other countries absorbed the pressure. That escape valve is narrowing, and when it narrows, policy choices disappear. Higher rates slow the economy, lower rates weaken the currency. Print too much and prices surge. Tighten too hard and debt service explodes. Every path carries a cost that used to be deferred. This is why the shift away from the dollar isn't announced with fanfare. It doesn't need to be. The system destabilizes itself once the feedback loop reverses. Meanwhile, BRICS doesn't need perfection. It needs enough functionality to reduce exposure. Even partial adoption creates leverage. Every oil contract settled outside the dollar is another reserve manager asking a simple question. Why hold what I don't need? Gold answers that question in one word: neutral. That's why central bank gold buying has surged at the fastest pace in decades. Not speculation, insurance. Gold doesn't default. It doesn't get frozen. It doesn't depend on another country's politics. China knows this history. So does Saudi Arabia. The Petroyuan isn't backed by trust in Beijing. It's backed by optionality. Settle in yuan, convert to gold, avoid dollars entirely. That pathway didn't exist before. Now it does. And the moment it exists, the dollar loses its monopoly on necessity. This doesn't cause collapse tomorrow. It causes fragility. Fragile systems look stable right up until they aren't. They rely on confidence that can't be measured until it breaks. And reserve currencies don't fall because people stop believing. They fall because people stop needing. That distinction matters, because belief can be restored. Necessity can't. Once energy trade proves it can function outside the dollar, the incentive to return disappears. And when the largest commodity on earth finds an exit, the rest eventually follow. The question isn't whether this accelerates. It's what happens when it does. History shows that reserve currency transitions don't look like revolutions. They look like erosion. Slow at first, then suddenly obvious. The British pound didn't lose dominance the day America surpassed Britain economically. It lost it after decades of debt, war costs, and shrinking trade relevance made holding pounds inconvenient. By the time the shift was visible, it was already irreversible. The same dynamic is unfolding now. What makes the current moment different is speed. Technology compresses timelines. Settlement systems that once took years to build now deploy in months. Trade agreements that once required full alignment now operate transaction by transaction. BRICS doesn't need a single currency. That's a misconception. Multipolar systems don't replace. They fragment. And fragmentation is enough. Energy trade is being rewritten deal by deal. LNG contracts, long-term supply agreements, strategic stockpiling. Each one reduces reliance on dollar liquidity just a little more. No announcement, no crisis. Just fewer dollars moving where they used to. Meanwhile, the U.S. still behaves as if demand is guaranteed. Deficits are expanding in a full employment economy. Entitlements grow automatically. Interest compounds mechanically. There's no political appetite for restraint because restraint was never required before. That's the danger of privilege. It trains systems to ignore limits. As foreign demand softens, domestic buyers are forced to absorb more issuance. Banks, funds, the Federal Reserve. That's manageable until it isn't, because every dollar absorbed internally pushes inflationary pressure back home. And inflation isn't just higher prices. It's social strain. It's political polarization. It's capital flight. It's pressure for controls that create more distortion. This is why reserve loss precedes internal instability, not the other way around. Saudi Arabia understands this better than most. Their pivot isn't ideological, it's defensive. They watched reserves frozen. They watched currencies weaponized. They saw leverage shift. Accepting yuan doesn't mean rejecting the dollar. It means refusing dependency. And dependency is the core vulnerability of any system. Once oil can be sold without touching U.S. financial rails, power decentralizes. Not dramatically, structurally. The world doesn't need to overthrow the dollar. It just needs redundancy. Redundancy removes urgency. Urgency is what gave the dollar its dominance. This is why officials dismiss the Petroyuan publicly. They focus on percentages, on market share, on present calm. But reserve status is lost at the margin, not the peak. It's lost when the world quietly decides there's no reason to rush back. And by the time policymakers react, the leverage they relied on is already gone. Because once optionality exists, pressure builds invisibly, until something forces it into the open. The The real risk isn't a headline announcing the end of the dollar. It's the chain reaction that follows when the old assumptions quietly stop working. When reserve demand fades, governments face choices they've avoided for decades. Cut spending, raise taxes, inflate away obligations. None are politically survivable at scale, so delays become policy. The United States has relied on time as a buffer. Roll the debt, refinance at lower rates, grow out of the problem. But those options depend on trust and demand staying intact. Once borrowing costs rise structurally, time stops being an ally. This is where the feedback loop tightens. Higher yields mean higher interest payments. Higher interest payments mean larger deficits. Larger deficits require more issuance. More issuance requires even higher yields. It's not dramatic at first. It's mathematical. And mathematics doesn't negotiate. Foreign buyers notice this before voters do. Capital moves quietly. Allocations shift gradually. But the effect compounds. Every marginal buyer that steps back forces more pressure inward. At the same time, BRICS nations gain leverage without firing a shot. Trade conducted outside the dollar avoids sanctions risk. It avoids exposure. It avoids entanglement. That alone makes it attractive. Saudi Arabia's role here isn't symbolic. It's catalytic. Their participation signals that even the most dollar-aligned actors are hedging. And hedging by leaders legitimizes hedging by everyone else. This is how reserve systems unravel. Not through rebellion, through risk management. The Petroyuan doesn't need to dominate oil markets. It just needs to exist long enough to normalize alternatives. Once normalized, adoption spreads organically. And here's the part rarely discussed. When the dollar's external role shrinks, internal consequences accelerate. Inflation becomes harder to suppress. Asset bubbles distort further. Social pressure rises as purchasing power erodes unevenly. That's when political instability feeds back into economic weakness. At that stage, policy errors become more frequent. Controls appear, blame shifts, confidence frays. This isn't speculation, it's sequence. Every previous reserve currency experienced this phase. The warning signs weren't collapse, they were rigidity. Leaders insisting nothing fundamental had changed while the structure underneath them already had. The dollar is still dominant, but dominance isn't permanence, it's momentum. And momentum, once lost, is nearly impossible to recover. The next phase doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up when the system is forced to respond to stress instead of shaping outcomes. And that moment is closer than it appears. Once a system shifts from control to reaction, its options narrow rapidly. That's the phase reserve currencies don't recover from. In the early stages, pressure can be managed. Swap lines are extended. Liquidity is injected. Markets are reassured. But those tools only work when confidence is already there. They can't create it once incentives change. That's what makes this moment different from past scares. BRICS isn't acting out of crisis. It's acting out of planning. This isn't a response to collapse. It's preparation for one. And preparation removes dependency before stress hits. Saudi Arabia didn't wait for instability. They moved while markets still looked calm. That timing matters. It signals foresight, not desperation. Meanwhile, U.S. policy remains locked in short-term cycles. Elections, fiscal cliffs, emergency measures. There's no long-term strategy to address structural imbalances because addressing them requires sacrifice. And sacrifice isn't rewarded politically, so the system drifts. Not because leaders are incompetent, but because incentives are misaligned. Each delay feels rational. Together, they create inevitability. As the dollar's external role shrinks, domestic strain intensifies, funding costs rise, consumption slows, asset values wobble. The pressure that once diffused globally concentrates internally. This is where history repeats. Britain didn't lose the pound because it wanted to. It lost it because maintaining it required austerity the public rejected. Spain didn't collapse because it ran out of silver overnight. It collapsed because dependence made adaptation impossible. The Soviet Union didn't dissolve because of invasion. It dissolved because the system couldn't fund itself. Reserve currency loss isn't a cause, it's a multiplier. It accelerates weaknesses that already exist. That's why this transition is so dangerous. The United States doesn't need the dollar to collapse to feel the impact. It only needs the world to need it less. And that process is already underway. The Petroyuan represents more than a new settlement option. It represents a psychological break. Proof that energy, the most critical commodity on Earth, can move without touching U.S. rails. Once that proof exists, the barrier is gone. From there, it's not about ideology or alliances. It's about efficiency and safety. And those incentives don't reverse easily. The final stage doesn't arrive with a countdown. It arrives when a shock hits a system that no longer has margin. And shocks always come. The only question is whether the structure can absorb it, or whether it finally gives way. When that shock arrives, the narrative will be familiar. Officials will say it's temporary. Markets will be told it's contained. Emergency measures will be framed as precautionary. And for a moment, it may even look like they're right. That's how late-stage systems behave. They hold until they don't. A financial shock doesn't need to be unprecedented. It just needs to arrive at the wrong time. A spike in energy prices, a failed auction, a geopolitical escalation, any stress that forces liquidity to be tested instead of assumed. In a dollar-centric world, those shocks were absorbed globally. In a fragmented world, they ricochet internally. That's the transition we're entering. The Petroyuan and parallel settlement systems don't cause the shock. They remove the buffers that once softened it. They make the consequences more localized, more political, more visible. This is when confidence becomes fragile. Once markets sense that policy tools are constrained, reactions change. Capital becomes defensive. Risk premiums rise. Volatility feeds on itself. And attempts to stabilize conditions often worsen them. That's how control slips. The most dangerous moment is when leaders believe they still have time. Because by the time the urgency is obvious, the exits are crowded. Options narrow to choices that were avoidable years earlier. This is why history doesn't repeat in detail, only in structure. Spain thought silver guaranteed security. Britain thought empire ensured relevance. The Soviet Union thought control ensured stability. Each assumption failed once incentives shifted. The United States assumes the dollar guarantees flexibility, but flexibility only exists while demand is external. As that demand erodes, trade-offs harden. This doesn't end with a single event. It ends with a realization that the world has already adjusted, that leverage is gone, that reactions are no longer shaping outcomes, only responding to them. And when that realization spreads, behavior changes fast. The final phase isn't announced, it's recognized. And by the time it's recognized, the transition is already complete. By the time the shift becomes undeniable, the question won't be who caused it. It will be who prepared for it. Reserve currency transitions don't end with collapse headlines. They end with reordering. Power moves quietly to systems that planned ahead. Those that assumed permanence are forced to adjust under pressure. The dollar won't vanish. That's not how this works. It will still be used, still traded, still powerful. But it won't be unavoidable. And that difference changes everything. When a currency stops being mandatory, discipline replaces privilege. Borrowing costs stop being optional. Deficits stop being abstract. Monetary policy stops being a lever and starts being a constraint. The advantages that once insulated the system reverse into liabilities. This is why the Petroyuan matters far beyond oil volumes. It represents the first successful breach of the dollar's energy monopoly, not a takeover, an escape route. And escape routes are permanent. Saudi Arabia didn't leave the system. They diversified away from dependence. BRICS didn't overthrow anything. They removed a single point of failure. That's how modern power shifts. Quietly, structurally, without asking permission. The United States still has time. But time without reform is just delay. And delay compounds costs. History is unforgiving on this point. Empires don't collapse because they're attacked. They collapse because they can no longer finance themselves without eroding internal stability. The warning signs are never hidden. They're dismissed. The petrodollar wasn't lost in a crisis. It was diluted in calm. And that's what makes this moment dangerous. Because most people still think nothing has changed, but something already has. The world is learning how to function without the dollar at its center. And once that learning spreads, it doesn't reverse. The shift won't be remembered for when it started. It will be remembered for when it became impossible to stop. And by then, the exits everyone assumed would be open won't be.